Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Katie Rigg. I'm Head of Safeguarding and Student Wellbeing at the Council of International Schools, CIS. And I just wanted to start this webinar by acknowledging the very difficult and uncertain times that we all find ourselves in at the moment, and saying that I hope that you're okay and I hope that your communities are okay. I've been in touch with a number of you already over the past few weeks, and it's really amazing to see the extraordinary efforts that everyone's making to support their communities. We also know that it can be quite an isolating time for people at the moment, and I just wanted to say that you're not alone, and that at CIS, we're all working and our partners are working really hard to help you to navigate this new reality that we all find ourselves in. At CIS, we've received a significant number of emails and calls and requests for help and questions and guidance over the last month or so. And so we've launched a number of initiatives in response to that. One of them is this article and webinar series, of which this is a part. This is the second webinar in the series, and it's looking specifically at how schools and universities can make sure that their new learning platforms comply with key data protection principles and uphold individuals' privacy rights. We've received a whole host of questions around that issue, including how can we make sure that our systems protect us against the increase in cybersecurity threats that we're seeing? How can we make sure that we prevent data protection breaches as much as possible when we're working in environments that we're unfamiliar with? How can we make sure that our online learning systems comply with key data protection law and don't expose us either financially or legally? And a lot of questions around recording or not recording for either safeguarding or learning reasons. So hopefully we'll be able to answer all of those in this hour. Just in terms of geography, I'm based in the Netherlands, which is where CIS's office is. Our speaker, Mark Orcherson, is based in the UK, and we have around 100 participants who have registered for this webinar who are based in countries all around the world. In terms of the outline for this webinar, we are going to start with Mark providing an overview of the key areas of challenge that we've identified already. So he'll speak for about 15 minutes. And then we'll spend the rest of the time on a Q&A essentially. So you can submit live questions in writing by pressing the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom or the top of your screen. And I will sift through those and pose them to Mark during the Q&A session. We would really encourage you to ask as many questions and post comments if you like as well, and then we can have more of an interactive discussion. There'll be a recording of this webinar available on the CIS membership portal to everyone afterwards. And we'll also send a follow-up email with links to any resources that we mention throughout the webinar. So I think the only thing left for me to do is to introduce our speaker, Mark Orcherson, who's Managing Director of Nine, which are specialists that work with schools and universities around the world on data protection, cybersecurity and technology. At CIS, we've been working with Nine for a number of years now, which has been really fantastic. They've been supporting our members all around the world. And thank you so much, Mark, for donating some of your time to this. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And I'd also like to say a big welcome to all of you that join us this morning. I'm not going to dwell too much on the technicalities of data protection, but I will give you an overview of the core principles. And I'll refer back to the GDPR as the core regulation that the technicalities of the principles all around the world come from. So in our experience of working with education institutions in Europe, the UK, the US, Thailand, Indonesia, in China, in Africa, generally speaking, 80% of data protection law is the same. So the terminology is generally the same. The core exception is within the US, where data protection law is actually quite far behind everywhere else in the world and generically speaking, it's quite fragmented in terms of the obligations. You have a thing called the California Consumer Privacy Act that I'm sure if you're from the USA, you'll understand that. But interestingly, in February, there has been a move to create a Central Data Protection Act at a federal level across the US. And that's likely to reflect core components of the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulations. Throughout the course of the presentation, I will be referring to specific education examples in terms of processing activity and concerns. And I do encourage you as we go along just to make note of any questions and fire them across, because if you have a question or a concern at this moment in time, given the challenges that we all face, I'm sure there are many others who also have that same question. So if you could volunteer that, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. So in terms of data protection law, it's really there to protect and reduce the risk of these things here: discrimination, identity theft, financial loss, etc. And there's three core components to data protection law. You've got governance and accountability, which is the documentation to demonstrate how we made a decision about something. So how do we make a decision around what platform we're going to use for virtual learning, or which platform we're going to use to get students introduced to universities. So that's a governance framework where we document the risks associated with that activity, and we understand what the risks are in these areas on individuals. The other third is data protection and information rights, which is the rights that, that students and parents and staff have in association with an organization that is processing their personal data. So as schools and universities, you are processing the personal data of staff, students, parents, and others. And those people have specific rights that they can instruct for you to do certain things, such as the subject access and whatnot. And lastly, we have information and cybersecurity. So essentially 1/3 of data protection law, no matter where you go, is all around how we protect the information that we collect. And when you hand over the personal information of staff, students, and parents to a third party, and that third party could be a learning platform, or it could be Zoom, or it could be from a school to a university. If you've collected that personal data in the first place, then you're handing it over to that university or that technology platform, you need to ensure that that platform manages and processes and secures that data in the same way that you would, in order to protect and reduce the risks of these points here. So that's why at this moment in time, there's quite a lot of discussion around what platforms are being used, and also what are the obligations on schools and universities to ensure they are compliant with the law. Now, if we look at the impact of the GDPR across the globe, essentially it was launched in May 2018, and then we have seen the local interpretation of data protection law outside of Europe. So within Europe, every country has had to take the GDPR and put it into law. So within the UK, that's in the Data Protection Act 2018. But in essence, any country that wants to have a relationship with Europe needs to demonstrate what's called a degree of adequacy in terms of how personal data is collected and processed, put that into local law, and then ensure there is local enforcement of data protection law, that if there's a breach in a country, and that essentially affects the individuals or European citizens, that the EU has recourse at a local level against those organisations that breach data protection law. So in Thailand, for example, I was working there a few weeks back. They have their PDPA, Personal Data Protection Act, that goes live this May, and essentially Thailand will be seeking an adequacy decision with the EU to say, hey, in Thailand, we've got great data protection laws and we also enforce it. But across most countries, there is now a flavour of the GDPR that goes into local law. But two other ways that most organizations are affected if there is not a local interpretation of the GDPR is contract law and data sharing agreements. So all the systems and services that you as an organization contract with, so if you have a student information system, or you have a HR system, or you have an app that you use, associated with that platform are terms and conditions or terms of service. And in many cases, those terms and conditions or terms of services will place contractual obligations on you as an organization to comply with the GDPR. And that's because most of those companies that develop those systems have chosen the GDPR as their global de facto privacy regulation. So by virtue of contract law, many organizations are required to comply with the GDPR. And if you are using those platforms, you are basically saying that when we collect the personal information of staff, students, and parents, and we transfer that or upload it into one of those platforms, you're saying, hey, we are compliant with the GDPR. And essentially, those platforms have to have a degree of certainty that you are. And if you're not, then their recourse is to stop you accessing those platforms. And lastly, the impact of data protection law comes through data sharing agreements. And this is where one party, such as a school, who transfers the data of staff and students to perhaps another school in a different country because they are sending students for an athletics competition, that a data sharing agreement will be set up between the two so that the school receiving the personal data and health information, contact details of the students for the athletics competition is saying, when we receive that information that you transfer over to us, we protect it in the same way that you do. So for you to understand, no matter where you're located, generally speaking, these are the 4 areas that data protection law will impact you and that you need to be aware of. And when we look at personal data in schools and universities, these are generally the aspects of personal data: photograph databases, school reports, medical reports, and CCTV, and child safeguarding and child protection reports. So all the personal data that is collected and it's processed. So processed means handled. So is that printed? Is it stored on a database? Who has access to it? All that personal data within schools and universities need to be documented. You need to understand where it is. You need to understand who it's shared with, and you need to understand who it's secured in order to be compliant with the law. Now, there are a number of principles and a lawful basis for data protection law. And it's really important that you understand this if we're going to talk around what the key challenges are. So the first one is being lawful, fair, and transparent. So we have a lawful basis to collect the information of people, and we're being fair and transparent around it. So lawful, that could be, we have someone's consent, or actually we have an education services contract to deliver. And referring to the blog that Katie and I wrote, and that was published yesterday, you will see that in many cases in a school environment, the lawful basis that we would refer you to would be contract. As a school, in order for us to deliver our side of the education services fee contracts, we have to collect certain types of personal data, and we have to process that in a way to deliver that. If we do not take that personal information or sensitive categories of data, we cannot deliver our side of the services contracts. And then being fair and transparent is that you're only using the information for basically the specific purposes. And the transparency is you're actually just telling people what you're doing with their personal data. So thinking about virtual schools and learning outside of the classroom, learning at home in its current context, it's really important that you tell people through the privacy notice that you need to use third-party platforms to deliver your side of the education services contracts, and that these are the protections that you have in place with those providers. The other principles are you only collect and process personal data for what you need, you're keeping information accurate, you're only keeping it for a specified length of time, and you make sure you have the appropriate level of security. Now, for each of these, I could go into a lot more detail, but for the purposes of today, that just gives you a general overview of the principles. And in terms of the lawful basis, we're not going to touch upon each of those. We're mainly going to talk about contract with the data owner and consent. But there are a number of others that you could rely upon if they were more appropriate. So some universities, for example, would rely upon public tasks, and in other circumstances, there may be a legal obligation to process certain types of personal data or share certain types of personal data specifically with authorities. So we see in Asia a lot of obligations on organizations to share the personal data of staff, students, primarily expats, with the local authorities. In terms of the challenges that we've identified, and Katie touched upon this within the introduction, there is a misnomer in terms of what is the correct lawful basis. And I've seen a lot of emails suggesting that if we're going to a virtual school, that we need to get the consent from the parents and the students to do so. Referring back to the blog, the relying upon consent as a lawful basis can put you in sort of precarious circumstances. So if you're asking for consent, then an individual can withdraw their consent. So in the circumstances where you want to continue charging your fees as a fee-paying school, if that's what you are, and I'm guessing the majority of you are, and you're asking for consent, and then someone doesn't give it to you, or they withdraw their consent during the process of you teaching them, then essentially you're impeding your ability to deliver your educational services contracts, which could give rise for a claim against you from a fee perspective of the parent saying, well, you asked us for consent, we didn't give it to you, you can't deliver the services, we want a refund on the fees. That's one aspect and one complexity of asking for consent. The correct lawful basis, generically speaking, in most cases, is going to be contract. And as an organization at a leadership level, you need to understand the difference between the lawful basis, because there are quite complex implications if you choose the wrong one. The next thing is the online providers are compliant with the law in your country. So we see a lot of instances where online providers aren't compliant. And one of the things that you need to do is to understand the level of compliance. Pressure to record or not to record, and we're going to touch upon that within the Q&As. Online recruitment fairs and yield events. So how do we ensure that we can essentially influence and market to students in the current circumstances? Because as a university, those students are our future customers, and we want to sell them our university. The misuse of recordings by students, parents, and staff, and then online harm. So these are all complex areas, and hopefully we'll touch upon them. So in wrapping up this first part around data protection, you need to be transparent with what you're doing. You need to do a risk assessment on the impact of individuals' rights. So whatever you're doing, whatever you change to what you're doing from in school and teaching in school to now outside of school, you need to understand the risks and what the impact is. And you have to have the right information security policies, procedures, and guidance to ensure that all staff understand what they should be doing. Lastly, just touching on the security of processing. So there is guidance at the moment in terms of what you should be doing. And your leadership within your schools should be looking at each of these individual bullet points to really understand whether you can do this with your staff being at home or working on their home devices, and what guidance and training is required to ensure that you're not placing your IT systems at risk. In terms of the risks that we are seeing, there are a number of types of attack that we are seeing, and these are the common breaches. But if we just flick onto the next slide, we'll then see that these current attacks are ones that we've seen before, but also that we are seeing to be more prevalent, given that people are working at home. I'll just focus on this one, which is sextortion, which is essentially someone doing open source intelligence of your staff. So they'll look on LinkedIn, they'll look on Facebook, they'll find out which teachers are in your school or which university. Then essentially they'll work out what their email address is, and they'll send them an email saying that they are, we know you're working from home, we know you're looking at pornography, we know that we've captured what you're doing, and we're going to share that information with your school, and you're going to lose your job unless you pay us X amount of Bitcoin. And because staff are isolated and they are vulnerable, you will see, on the basis that they haven't been looking at pornography, paying Bitcoin, just so, because there's a risk that their school they may find out, or there will be a difficult conversation to be had. But the other areas that we are seeing, early bird fees and financial data and lockout. And the early bird fees is around, well, no, the school's working virtually, we're going to give you a greater discount now, pay your fee money into this bank account. And as leadership within your schools and universities, you need to be aware of those things, and you need to put in greater safeguards to limit the impact on you as individuals. So there we are. That's just an overview in terms of where we are and what the risks are. And I'm going to hand over to Katie now for some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. So we've had a number of questions already, and a couple of questions which are sort of 5 questions in one question. So we'll try and address as many as we can. So the first one is actually something that I have received so many emails about. And so I just want to address it first of all. It's a question around the different platforms, Mark, and which ones are some better than others, and what are the sorts of things they should be looking for when they're using a platform. So just from the emails that I've received, it seems that, so I think platforms like Zoom, Google Hangout, Microsoft Teams are the 3 sort of most common ones that I'm seeing, but I'm sure there are others. Yep. And there do seem to be differences between the security levels within each platform. So Zoom, for example, has different levels. Something that I think is really important to check is whether you, as an institution setting up a virtual lesson, have the ability to remove participants from the lesson and ban participants from the lesson, and what the security is around the links that are generated for the class. Because one of the most common things that I've seen people write into me about recently is that they've set up a virtual lesson, the students have forwarded the link on, other people, sometimes students, sometimes adults, sometimes strangers, have joined the class and started sharing inappropriate material. And of course, the faculty member or the teacher has removed that person, but some of the software doesn't allow you to ban them. So they've just sort of come straight back in. So that would be sort of one difference that I've seen, where some people have said, actually, some platforms are much better than others in that respect. I don't know, Mark, if you have some other sort of examples or thoughts on different platforms.
Yeah, quite clearly. There's there is a clear challenge with the platforms that are currently out there, and in the immediacy of virtual learning or remote schools or whatever you want to term it, it's important to get yourselves up and running very, very quickly. So most schools have just gone and chosen a platform. So there's lots of schools that have chosen Google Meet because a lot of international schools rely upon the Google platform. Google Meet as a platform doesn't provide the level of restrictions that actually you need as a school. So that will place you at greater risk in terms of the ability for other people to join it. And we have examples with some schools we're working with in Hong Kong where this is the case. And they reverted, they left Google Meets because of this issue, and just used Google Chats as the means of doing it, because you can control and you can specifically invite individuals into that group. Likewise with Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is stronger than Google Meet, but unless you have authentication at a group level, and I'm getting technical now, in terms of your directory, then it's difficult to set up groups of classes And so teachers then have to manually go through the process of setting up classes for the kids to join, which is great because it provides a lot more control over who's joining. But there's an admin overhead there that someone needs to manage and then continually manage. With Zoom, Zoom seems to be the platform of choice. Yet we are seeing a lot of performance issues with Zoom. Likewise, we are seeing performance issues with Teams. But Zoom does seem to give you more granularity in terms of what you're doing. So that's just like a quick overview of different platforms.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think I had an email this morning actually from a school who said that they contacted Google Hangouts or Google Meets or one of the two to talk about this issue of banning participants. And Google wrote straight back and said, we're on it. We've had so many complaints and we're developing a plan. So I think it is worth it also to get in touch with the platform itself and just see if there are other things that they can offer or what they're doing.
I would not. I mean, my core message here, I think, is start with something that's easy for you to use that you've currently got. But there are greater things to be concerned about in terms of the platform, and that one is just one of them. But there's a whole range of other safeguarding concerns that you need to work through. And it's likely you'll determine that the current platform you're using is not the right one. You're coming up to the Easter break, and I would thoroughly encourage you as a school to sit down and document what are your requirements in terms of how you're going to be delivering your lessons. What is it synchronous learning? Is it asynchronous learning? Which platforms allow us to do the right thing? What's the data protection issues? What are the safeguarding issues? And it's probably more likely that you're going to move away from your current platform, but you have the opportunity to do that now over this Easter break. If you don't do it now over the Easter break, you're putting yourself and your organization at greater risk, not only from a safeguarding perspective, but also from a data protection perspective, because you'll be seen not to take proportionate action to minimize the impact on your staff and students.
And that ties in really nicely with another question which has come in, which is around this difference between individual accounts and institutional accounts. So we had a question just now saying that the institution has Google, but some individual faculty members or teachers have set up some Zoom accounts and actually prefer that. And what are the risks around sort of allowing individual accounts versus institutional accounts?
Very good question. So when an individual has set up their own account, the organisation or the institution entirely loses control and the propagation of the personal data that's being collected, recorded, stored, or shared. So, from a data protection perspective, it's a bad idea. From a safeguarding and child protection perspective, it's a very, very bad idea. So, and this could place your organization into a whole world of complexity based upon what that individual or individuals are doing through their own personal accounts. So if they're going back to my point that I've just made around this Easter break, if there are individuals within your institution that are using a different platform because the functionality is better for them, then you need to evaluate whether that's the right platform for you as an entire organization. If it's not better for your entire organization and you stick with your existing platform, then you need to have measures in place to ensure that individuals do not divert from your policy, and you need to better hold those individuals to account, because they could be willfully negligent in safeguarding and willfully negligent in terms of data protection, in terms of their behaviours of ignoring your policies.
Brilliant. And the other thing we've seen linked to that is when some staff or faculty have set up their own sort of informal WhatsApp chat or other ways of talking to each other, which aren't under an institutional account. There have been some cases recently of disclosure of sensitive data about individual students, because I think the staff members just aren't necessarily as used to complying with the confidentiality rules on informal chats as they are when they're writing an email from a school or university email account. So I'd say that that's another point to take away for institutions, which is to have a conversation with your staff and your faculty, just reminding them about the confidentiality policies and the fact that they shouldn't be disclosing personal information about individual students, whether it's on a WhatsApp chat or a school email, unless of course it's in accordance with the school's policies and they need to share that information to safeguard the student. So another question which you touched upon, Mark, but I think it would be helpful to just go into a bit more detail, is around this issue of consent. So we've had a couple of questions just come in saying, we wrote to our parents to ask their consent to use like X platform, but now we want to move to Y platform. Is that okay? And if institutions aren't going to rely on consent in GDPR, do they still in practice need to obtain consent, or should they just be informing their parents?
Yeah, so the first thing I would do is I would write a revised privacy notice that explains to parents and children that a core part of processing personal data at school is using a video communications platform. You don't need to say it's Zoom or Google Meet or whatever. What you then need to do is say that you have evaluated and you evaluated what are the risks of processing using those platforms, and you have appropriate safeguards and measures in place to protect the personal data. You need to ensure that all parents and staff and have received that privacy notice. On the consent basis, going back to my point in the presentation, is that you do not want to rely upon consent in a data protection perspective. You may be asking consent of parents on the basis that, as you would for a school trip, that, we need your parental consent to send the children on a school trip. Therefore, we're asking the parental consent that when they're at home, they're going to use the laptop for video conferencing. That is different from consent for data protection. And what you do not want to be asking for is consent for data protection. The reason why you are doing video conferencing for teaching and learning is to ensure that you deliver your part of the educational services contract. Because if you do not do that, then the parents, depending what's in your fee contract, has the right to not pay you. So you do not want to be in that position. And we can provide advice and guidance. Look at your fee contract if that's an issue, or if you've put yourself in a position where you have asked for consent in a data protection perspective, we will better support you to backpedal from that position.
Brilliant. And that ties into another question which we received, which is, can you advise us further on actions that institutions should take to demonstrate that they are fulfilling those obligations that are in their contracts? So, for example, if parents are questioning, the value of online learning versus in-person learning, what have you seen institutions do to try and demonstrate the value of that?
Great. So the first thing is you need to ensure that you have evaluated who you're going to be using for the online learning. If you go to the blog that Katie and I wrote, you can download at the bottom there's a resource for a process for assessments, which allows you to identify the risks of doing so and not doing so. So go ahead and do that. And if you submit it to us by Friday, all of the schools and institutions that do that, you'll get a copy of what they've done. So most schools are then doing an element of recording to validate the quality of education that is being delivered via remotely. That is entirely legitimate for you to do recording of those lessons and for someone to peer review those lessons. But how it all goes together, I don't say how your strategy for teaching and learning goes together, needs to be clear for you to measure the value of the lesson that's being delivered. Because if you're just doing a lesson and not doing then the structured work that sits behind it, and then correlating back to whether the student has learned anything, then that's going to be a challenge. So what we're seeing with some of our more successful schools is they are sticking to more a rigid teaching structure, and then they're using their learning environment where they post the resources. And your learning environment could be a Firefly or it could be Google Classroom or whatnot. And then the expectation is then that the teachers can still measure to some degree the value of what's being delivered. And through that process at a whole school level, you can demonstrate that you are continuing to deliver what you said you would do within the fee contracts.
Brilliant.
Now, obviously, there is. Now, I'm not getting into the legalities of everything, but there's obviously a detriment to parents of having the children at home and then not getting the full value. But then that's a determinant. So we're seeing schools in the specifically independent schools in the UK, they're offering a 15 or 20% discount on their fees because they're not getting that full value. That's more of a discussion at a leadership level in terms of looking at everything in the whole.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I love how these are all moving into my following questions. So you were talking about recording, which is, we've just received a number of questions about recording. So whether to record and what is a risk assessment. So I think if I just start to answer it, Mark, and then I'll hand it over to you, because we've looked at this issue in quite a lot of detail, and we've been talking to other sort of partners about it. And I think there are, so there's a lot of questions around, should institutions require their counsellors or psychologists to record virtual counselling sessions? So we've talked to psychologists in the International School Counselling Association about this, and we're all aligned that we wouldn't recommend that institutions require them to record those sessions. And there are a number of reasons for that, including it changes the nature of the confidentiality of the session. We're finding that students are then opting out of the counselling sessions because they don't want to be recorded, whereas actually now is a time when they really do need that counselling, or it changes the nature of the discussion. And so in the follow-up email we'll send, we'll include a link to an article where we detail the rationale behind that. That only deals with counselling sessions. So when you're looking at virtual learning classes and educational sessions, then absolutely, there may well be some sessions that you do decide to record, for example, for reasons that Mark was just talking about. So to demonstrate the quality of the teaching and learning, or for professional development reasons, or for other reasons. But we would urge you to look at that. So in your Easter break, when you're looking at which platforms to use, take a step back and do a general risk and benefits analysis of your online learning. So that will include, what are the risks and benefits of different platforms? What are the risks and benefits of live streaming as opposed to pre-recording? And what are the risks and benefits of recording some live classes? And so we have received a number of emails from schools and universities who have got into difficult territory having recorded live sessions. So that includes accidental or inadvertent recording of very sensitive information. So making sure that, in the background behind your staff or your faculty member, there's nothing there that's inappropriate or sensitive. We've also had issues of inappropriate material being shared on live classes, which have then been recorded, and then the institution is in some cases has found themselves in possession of illegal material because the material that was shared in that class was itself illegal. So when you do the question, what is a risk assessment? It's basically weighing up the different risks and benefits of different options, and then making a decision based on the information available to you. In terms of recording, absolutely, if you have a good learning or safeguarding reason and recording is proportionate to achieve that objective, then I think it's legitimate for some schools and universities to record some sessions. That's sort of our position. Mark, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, quite clearly. So there's a number of points here. There's recording of the schools, so the schools enforcing the recording of the lesson for the reasons that Katie, you've just described. So the first thing is for in every circumstance where you feel recording needs to take place, then you need to have a reason. Now, you can't just say we're going to blanket record every single lesson, because would you blanket record every single lesson that happens in school when the children are in school? So if you're not recording them when they're in school in a lesson, then you don't have a reason to record them if at every lesson when they're virtually working at home. Now, I will segue that with one of our schools is doing something that's entirely appropriate. They are recording the lesson but they aren't recording the video. So the teacher is talking and delivering the lesson. It's being recorded, and that's being posted on the learning environment to allow the students to go back and reflect on the learning that was delivered in that session. And that does a number of things. It also supports the school to evidence that it's delivering its side of the education services contracts. But they are paying particular attention to actually when video is required and in what lessons. The other side of the coin is the guidance that you give to parents and students in the recording of any sessions, because the school can have control and record, but also parents and students can. And then we've seen some circumstances where that has occurred, and that in essence can cause an infringement on the rights of the teacher or an infringement of the rights of the other students who are being recorded and that being shared. So it needs to be evidently clear in your policy to parents and students that if they do record any lessons and they share any lessons, that essentially that is a breach of the school's policy, is an infringement of individuals' rights. And consequently, there needs to be actions taken against those individuals, against those parents and students, to make it dissuasive from other people to follow their behaviour. And it's clear that that has to be within your policy. And if you don't do that as a policy, then you as a school are placing your teachers at risk and possibly infringing on their rights.
Brilliant, thank you. Which leads into another question around retention periods. So what would your advice be on how long schools and universities should keep videos or photos of children on Drive submitted through Google Classroom, or recordings of virtual conferences?
Okay, great. So let's say your purpose of recording lessons is so that you can ensure a level of quality in the delivery of the curriculum vis-a-vis your educational services contracts. So that is your purpose, that you can manage quality. You are entirely within your rights to say that we are going to keep those recordings of those lessons for a period of, let's say, 3 years. And we're doing it for a period of 3 years because in that period of 3 years, there is potential that we'll have legal claims against us for a refund of the fees, and actually having this evidence to demonstrate that we have delivered a robust curriculum and delivered our part of the educational services contract will enable us to defend the claim that may arise in the future. So you need to, on that basis, I mean, I made up the figure of 3 years, but you need to make a determination based upon what those potential risks are. Likewise is with the photographs of the students. You may feel that actually there is a safeguarding concern associated with a number of students, and actually you have recorded some evidence of those safeguarding concerns on video. And in those circumstances, you are keeping those specific recordings for longer than 3 years, because it may need to aid a future investigation associated with that child. So for that reason, I've just described two different circumstances where that need to be considered in terms of the duration of keeping the recording. And what you need to do is go through what those circumstances could be and determine which video which recording sits into which category.
And then in terms of where they should store recordings?
Centrally, so not on the individual's machine. Do not, as a policy, you should not allow anyone to store anything locally on their machine. A lot of people are using their home devices. Even the organizational devices in many of the institutions are Macs. Those Macs are not under any form of management. They are set up as home devices like you would buy from the Apple Store. And you are placing your organization at risk should you allow anyone to store anything locally. It needs to be on Google Drive or not Office 365, or you need to provide access to some other cloud-based storage that people can access to store their materials and video.
Brilliant. And then that also ties into the next question we received, which was around personal devices and security. And so just in light of what you were talking about, Mark, this increase in sort of cyber security attacks and phishing scams and stuff, what are the key things that institutions can do to sort of enhance their security if their staff are working on personal devices? Like, should they require them to meet certain standards?
Yep, exactly. You need to have a home working policy. And if you haven't got one, then Easter's the time for you to develop one. We have a systems and security service that we have all these templates available for you. You need to set specific parameters in place that if staff do not follow those, then there is some action that will be taken against them. So the first one is keeping the security software up to date. That they will, on a weekly basis or whatever it is, they will ensure that their device, whether it be Windows or whether it be Microsoft or Google, is always up to date, and the apps that they use are always up to date. They need to be extra vigilant in terms of what they are accessing and when. So if they are working on a browser, and then they open up another tab in that browser and it's lunchtime and they start looking on the internet for shopping or something, and they then click on something, they can inadvertently provide access to the passwords in the browser, which is associated with their school account. So you will need to ask them to differentiate between when they're using their schoolwork in a browser and when they are using personal browsing in a different browser, and either one of those is perhaps an incognito browser if you're using Chrome. And what you're trying to do is try and create a firewall and differentiate between the two, because if they click a link and they download something, they can compromise your systems. You should look at all your users and work out which ones need two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication if you haven't done so already, because of the risks posed with phishing. You need to ensure that staff understand how data should be backed up, and actually backed up to your cloud, because the unavailability of data can have implications not only from a data protection perspective, but from safeguarding. I've already touched upon passwords in terms of multi-factor authentication. You need to enforce strong password use. So that's not password 1, 2, 3, 4. It's picking, like, for example, 3 separate words that together make a strong password. But all that should be communicated within a home working policy. And I would encourage you to then do a webinar such as this, where you present to all your staff saying, this is the expectations for security when you're working from home.
And presumably linked to that is the breach protocol. And so if they have a data protection breach, or an individual is the victim of a sort of cybersecurity attack or a phishing scam, having really clear reporting lines up to hopefully the data protection officer or the equivalent if you don't have a data protection officer. And I don't know, Mark, if you can say a few words around the role of the DPO at the moment, because we had some questions about that.
Yeah. So if you're formally named, or you have a formal named data protection officer, and that's a legal term specifically within the GDPR within Europe, then they have certain protections and responsibilities. Their role is an advisory role to the data processors, or the data owners within the school. So they're not a doer, they're an advisory asset, an advisory resource, where they need to support the organization in understanding where the risks are, and then provide advice and guidance in terms of what the organization should be doing. In most cases, you will find that the DPO, or if they're not a named DPO, maybe the data protection lead or your data protection team, are unlikely to have the experience and breadth and depth of expertise in dealing with all the issues that we've been speaking about today. So they need some professional support. So and under law within the EU, you as an institution are required to provide them with legal, HR, IT, and security advice. That is written into law. So as an institution, you need to be working out what support does my internal team need to advise the rest of my organization. We have a service called DPO Essentials that provides unlimited support to that team. So if you need support in terms of legal capacity, IT, security, then you can access it through that service. But you may have local counsel or local legal support that can provide that.
Brilliant. And then just when you're thinking about updating your policies or any reporting protocols, just think about contact details and time zones, because you might be operating now in different time zones from some students or staff. So making sure that there is someone who students and staff can reach out to sort of in their time zone as well, and someone who's available.
I'll just add to that, Katie. I'll just add to this, that you're going to see a lot of small data protection breaches of people working from home. That is entirely fine, so long as you capture them all. So your team, someone needs to be capturing what are the data protection breaches, because then that informs the training that you provide to all of your staff. If you haven't had any data protection breaches and you're not aware of any breaches, then that is a concern. That just shouts that people do not understand what a data protection breach is. In this instance, the more breaches that you're having, the better, because it provides you with a better understanding of where your risks are. Great,
thank you. So the next question is around marketing and posting photos and videos sort of on social media or on websites. And I suppose it's linked to our previous discussion around how institutions can demonstrate that, the amazing job that their staff are doing and the extraordinary efforts that they're making and stuff. So by posting photos and videos online about it, there was just a question around consent and some nervousness, I think, around some institutions maybe posting photos and videos of children on social media, for example.
Yeah, okay. So there are two sides to this coin. You've got the data protection side, which is if someone's identifiable, then you need to have consent in terms of posting their photograph. So if you can see my face on a Twitter feed, then essentially I'm identifiable. You can take that picture and do a reverse Google look up and find my identity very, very, very quickly. So where you are using the images of children, then you need to ensure that you have consent of them and their parents. From a safeguarding perspective, there are greater concerns if that child is identifiable, because if you can identify a child on a Twitter feed through taking a snapshot of that photo and then putting them through a reverse photograph search engine, you can potentially, or someone could potentially find their social media profile and get into contact with that child that way. And that's a safeguarding concern. So the two sides to what you're doing. If you are looking to promote your organization to demonstrate how great you are, because you are essentially seeking to attract new students, you want to say how great you are at virtual learning and how great your institution is. That is in essence advertising, and it's advertising to the extent that any other organization will be advertising on social media. So you need to think about what are the implications of your advertising using the images that you have, and does the individual know that you're specifically using their images for advertising? Because advertising is slightly different than just showing the values and the benefits of your school. So it's quite a hazy area, and it's also quite complicated. When you start using social media like Instagram, and you are doing paid for advertisements with images of your students, the aggregation of an individual search can be influencing their behavior. Instagram is all around how do I influence someone's behavior, and by virtue of you paying for that and using images of people to do so, then your promotion may have a negative impact on individuals. So you need to really think about what are the implications of you trying to promote your organization if it's advertising, as a side to just saying, oh great, we're a school or we're a university, we're continuing to teach our kids or our students.
Great. And then a question just came in linked to that, Mark, around the consent. So when you say that they should seek consent to use the photos and images, can that be via email?
Yeah. So consent needs to be informed. It needs to be clear. So you need to clearly say to the whoever it is you're asking for, we will be using the image of you in these areas, on these platforms, for these reasons. If you withdraw your consent, as you can do at any time you wish, this is what we are going to do. It's going to take us 30 days to go through and take down all those images, etc., etc., etc. So you can do it via email, so long as it is clear, concise, unambiguous, etc.
Great. Okay, so we have 2 final questions in 4 minutes. So challenge. So the first one is still around this recording issue. So a couple of people have written in and said they're recording all of their classes. They did do a risk and benefits analysis and they decided that they were going to record everything. They haven't had any pressure or complaints from parents. What's your advice? I think the only thing I would say is we have had a number of institutions whose parents have started to complain about blanket recording and write in directly and say that they're worried that their privacy rights being infringed. Is it normal that they're just recording everything? So we are seeing complaints sort of start to arise. But Mark, what's your advice?
My first point would be, have you clearly informed through a privacy notice the parents, staff and students the reasons for why you're recording? That's the first point. Second point is the recording actually a proportionate measure to what you're trying to achieve? So what is it that you're trying to achieve, and why does recording support that measure? Is it proportion? Lastly is objectivity. Is the decision that you've made to record actually objective? So could you sit around the table and go, we've made this decision, and it's a completely objective decision to meet our means. And the fourth thing is that you have a clear list of all the different reasons why you're recording, and the aggregation of all those reasons equals record every single lesson. If you haven't got that working out, you are in breach of data protection law.
Brilliant. And then the final question, Mark, is just what support is available to CIS member schools and universities through 9?
Perfect. So if you go to the blog that Katie and I wrote, there are a number of different resources there. You have a processor evaluation for evaluating the platforms, not even the platforms, but any apps that are being used. So you can collaborate together, you fill it out, we quality assure it, and then we post those all back out to all the schools that have completed one. If you don't complete one, you don't get access to the entire list. For schools, there's the CIS self-assessment where you can benchmark yourself against the accreditation protocol. So you all should be familiar. There are standards and criteria in the revised protocol. And to benchmark where you currently sit, you can download the self-assessment. 9 provides 1 hour of free time per year to all CIS schools and institutions for you to seek some support from our in-house legal counsel with your any issues. We have a new web app that's being launched in May, which is a complete risk and compliance management platform where all these different things that you need to document are documented, and that comes with unlimited support for any issue for each year of subscription. So we have a number of support packages. And lastly, we have a systems and security support that provides you and gives you confidence in terms of how secure your school is, how secure are people working at home, what do we need to do from a technology perspective to secure the personal data of our staff and students given these unique circumstances. So hopefully and also on the blog, there's a range of other support and that can be provided.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. And in the follow-up email, we'll send a link to that blog. We'll also copy you in, Mark, if that's okay, so that we can reach out to you directly. There are a couple of questions that we haven't been able to answer, but we will address those in the follow-up email as well. And yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for your time and for your support. It's been brilliant and I hope really helpful to all of you. And I think the final thing to say is just to remember that these are sort of unprecedented and exceptional times, and you're not going to be able to do things to the usual standard, and things aren't going to be perfect, and you're going to have to make risk and benefits analysis on the basis of information that you have now, and then keep it up to date because that information might change. And I think we're all in uncharted territories. So yeah, and also a final note, just to look after yourselves and look after your staff. And I think the learning really for me from our institutions in Asia who've been doing this for longer is the high rates of staff burnout, and to make sure that you do look after yourselves. And to that end, we've got some future webinars later this week on mental health and wellbeing, and then one next week, which we'll send an email about as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.